Good afternoon. My name is Dianne Otto, and my role here today as a representative of Melbourne Law School comes with pleasures. The first is to welcome you all to this important and happy event where we can celebrate Di's work, her achievements, and her role in taking up the inaugural Francine V McNiff Chair in Human Rights Law at Melbourne Law School. But it comes with duties too in how that welcome is to be conducted. The first of these duties is to acknowledge that we meet on Indigenous country to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, a place of and in their law, taken care of by their honoured custodians past and present, to whom we pay respect. I want today in particular to pay respect to the senior women of the Kulin Nation and the leadership they take in caring for their land through their law. The second duty is to acknowledge that we meet on country in this building, a place of learning about law and an institution of Anglo-Australian law. As a member of this law school, it means I acknowledge as part of this welcome that we need to take care of our law also. We are also custodians of a legal tradition that we teach, learn and practice, and it is important to reflect upon how we might live with our law well, with integrity, when we engage in those activities. This includes taking responsibility for the relations with Aboriginal people that have been conducted in law and on and over land for a long time and continue today. I think it's important to keep those ideas of law and responsibility in mind today. This is because we're here to celebrate and honour how the traditions of our own jurisprudence have been cared for and challenged by senior women of our own law, feminists who have centralised the importance of considering the status and condition of women in law throughout their careers, and in doing so have given leadership, shape and momentum to a feminist legal movement. Our ceremonies today are given purpose by three such women. The first, of course, is Dianne Otto, who is the reason we're gathered here together this afternoon. And the formal part of her lecture, Feminist Encounters with International Human Rights Law, about which she'll speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, will be followed by time for conversation with all of you, as Di will take questions for about 15 minutes before we close. The second is Francine McNiff, who was a trailblazer, someone who taught criminal law when women were not heavily represented on faculty in law schools, who went to the bar and took up judicial office when that was a lonely thing for a woman to do. Francine's commitment to human rights and to making possible justice for others has been ongoing, and it is her generosity that has endowed the University and the Melbourne Law School with this chair that Di now proudly holds. And the third is Hilary Charleswood, who will speak to us in just a moment to formally introduce Di and frame her work. And a great part of the pleasure of my role today is to introduce Hilary, although I think all would agree she needs a little introduction. She is, of course, Distinguished Professor of International Law and Human Rights, Director of the Centre for International Governance and Justice in the Regulatory Institutions Network at the Australian National University in Canberra, and she also currently holds an ARC Laureate Fellowship. Throughout her work, Hilary has reimagined what it might mean to conduct a life as an international lawyer and what commitments that entails. She has spent her career rethinking the responsibilities of the relations between states, between the national and the international community, and the role and function of law in regulating those relationships in order to protect the human rights of subjects of law. That she has done so as a feminist, recognising in her corpus of work the central and profound significance that there is no one true story of how law's authority has been experienced, yet that law's authority must nevertheless be questioned and examined. Hilary has shown us over time not only that international law needs feminist perspectives, but that to conduct oneself as a feminist in the academy, to recognise that you are part of a political and intellectual movement, has produced excellent scholarship and excellent legal practices, as well as provided encouragement and example to instil the same motivations and responsibilities in others. So Hilary is here today not only to introduce Di and her work, as they are both leading scholars of international law, but because Di is one of the many that Hilary has inspired and supported as a teacher and colleague, as well as a friend and scholar, and because the acknowledgement of these relationships as forming a movement is an important part of our ceremonial duties as well as our celebrations. So I will now hand over to Hilary and ask you to warmly welcome her.
welcome everybody. And I just want to say what a huge pleasure it is to participate in this celebration of Dianne Otto's installation as the Francine V McNiff. I want to know why she liked her middle initials so much in human rights law at the Melbourne Law School. And many thanks, Anne, for that very generous and lovely introduction. I was thinking as I was preparing for today and I was just telling Di before, a hugely enjoyable time going back, reading a lot of Di's work that I'd read, but rereading it with in a sort of real Dianne Otto blitz, which has been a great pleasure over the past few weeks. But it just occurred to me that in the general helter-skelter of teaching, writing deadlines and endless grant applications, it's really very rare that we take the time to pause and celebrate the accomplishments of our academic colleagues and friends. And so it's really a very special delight. We often do it at the ends of people's lives, but not when they're so vividly alive. So it's a wonderful thing to do. Now, you'll hear quite a lot about Francine McNiff, and you'll learn that she was the first woman appointed as judicial officer in Victoria. And Di and I were just reflecting, it's sort of completely shocking to me to think that was in 1983, and she was appointed as a children's court magistrate. And she was at that age, she was 35 when she was appointed, so obviously pretty remarkable. But it was quite interesting in just going back and looking at some of the press coverage at the time, an article in The Age that really emphasised that she was appointed, and there was a nice quote from John Cain, the Premier at the time, about how it was good she'd been appointed. But everybody was bending over backwards to emphasise, look, she's just as able, we think, as her male colleagues. And I think maybe one sign of progress is that perhaps, but only just perhaps, we've moved on from those terrible reflections on women's appointment. But she was known a lot for her reforming zeal, especially with respect to criminal children's law. And also she's endowed 2 chairs at the University of Melbourne, so clearly she's also an educational philanthropist. But it struck me as I read about Francine McNiff how Di is just the perfect, absolutely perfect appointment for such a position. So some of you will already know that Di came to legal study only after a long period of working with community groups in advocacy and community development. So she started off, her hometown is Adelaide, and she started off studying arts at the University of Adelaide. And then she worked for almost 15 years in Melbourne with young homeless people, people who'd survived domestic violence, and people with psychiatric disabilities. And it's always struck me that those experiences have really developed in Di a deep empathy with people who are at the margins of our social system and who fall through its cracks. And I think that sensibility has imbued really all of Di's academic work and practice. I first came to know Di as a student at the University of Melbourne. So she started studying law at Monash in 1990 and then transferred to Melbourne. And I must say, I'd noticed her, I was teaching human rights law then, and I noticed her sort of out of the corner of my eye in my human rights law class, mainly because of the vivid colour of her glasses and her clothes, not to mention her hair. And she really stood out from all the very black-garbed undergraduates in the class. And I sort of assumed how, I don't know, some other teachers in the room may remember how you sort of make up stories, you create personalities for the people you see in your classroom. And my story about Di before was that she was sort of an artist or a bohemian or a musician. And I thought she was just taking up law as sort of a sideline. And so I just sort of thought, oh, she's this groovy sort of person and she's just floating in and out of this classroom. And I was really startled. I made everybody give a class paper, and I still recall to this day Di's class paper on the Genocide Convention. And she was about the 3rd speaker, and there'd been, forgive me for saying this, a number of rather ho-hum presentations on very worthy human rights topics. And I was just sort of gearing up for yet another one, when, against my stereotype of this bohemian, perhaps even this dilettante character, she suddenly came out with this brilliant, completely brilliant, startling analysis of the convention and its limited language. And then she displayed then, if I go back to that first encounter with Di, what I've really now come to recognise as a hallmark of her scholarly style. So this is really a mastery of the technical details of law, but this is combined with a deep appreciation of the power of legal theory, as well as a keen attention to the political consequences of a particular legal stance. So her arguments, although always grounded in social justice, they're always based on a close reading of legal texts, and she never takes the easy option of some human rights lawyers, including myself, of simply asserting the virtue of her position. And I'm happy to say that as a student, I persuaded Di to work as a short time as a research assistant for me, and I can't bear to throw them out. I still have this collection of Di's in those days. This shows you how long ago it was, before the internet. She wrote on index cards. That's how we preserved our research. And Di has very beautiful handwriting. I don't know where that comes from, but it's very beautiful handwriting. And I can't bear to throw out this collection of Di's handwritten cards on the CEDAW Convention. And I must say, I continue to learn from her and to look for her as inspiration, as a highly organised and effective scholar. So quite apart from the distinctive and original path that Di has taken in legal academia, she's been really very, very active as a contributor to the international human rights community. So she's been involved with many Australian and international NGOs, doing human rights training, for example. And she's also, and this is perhaps underknown in Australia, she's been a really influential contributor to the development of general comments by UN human rights treaty bodies. And more recently, she's been a member of an expert panel in Cambodia on gender-based violence in conflict. What I'd like to do is to identify briefly some of the contributions Di has made to legal scholarship. So one, which is the topic for today's address, is in the field of feminist theory and international law. Now, while much work in this field has focused simply on the absence of women or overt forms of discrimination, Di's analysis of women's human rights really, I think, was one of the first to take that field out of its rather limited framework and connected it, for example, to international economic developments. And so I think of an article, a really significant article she wrote in 1996 on the outcomes of the Beijing Conference of Women held in 1995, where she really highlights the neoliberal assumptions of the international legal order, an aspect of the negotiations that really went unremarked by other scholars. And more recently, Di's work on the regulation of sexuality in peacekeeping has unsettled the prevailing scholarship and presented a really radical critique of the so-called zero-tolerance policies of the UN. Now, many feminists sort of hailed the zero-tolerance approach to sex between UN peacekeepers and local populations. But Di's work in this area argued that it was important to examine the complex sexual economies that surround peacekeeping and understand what those sexual transactions meant to the participants. And she argued that the zero-tolerance policies made the problem one of simply sex, rather than one of survival or labour, or indeed, she argues, pleasure. Another major contribution has been Di's articulation of post-colonial critiques of international law, which linked the areas of race, gender and sexuality in a powerful way. And she's drawn attention, and I'm quoting from one of her pieces here, to the allegedly universal subject of human rights law and the way that it reproduces hierarchies, including those of gender, race, culture, nation, socioeconomic status and sexuality. And she's participated in really important work, I think, identifying the elements of what a queer theory in international law might show. And in a great contribution, she proposed, startlingly perhaps, that the Vatican may provide a starting point for imagining what a queer state might look like by sort of going against some of the standard views of the Vatican, a particular critique by Maurice Mendelssohn, who said, oh, well, the Vatican couldn't possibly be considered a nation state because of the lack of reproductive turnover there. And Di sort of uses it to criticise the link between reproductive continuity and statehood. I think her work also in another area, and you can see how how broadly she's worked, her work on economic, social and cultural rights has been really very significant. She's illuminated debates about the status and impact of the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and written very perceptively about the protection of these rights in Australia. And her involvement with both Australian and international NGOs in this area has demonstrated her really distinctive capacity to connect theory and practice. So as you're going to see, I suspect, in Di's lecture, her work has had particular impact precisely because it's not doctrinaire. It's subtle and reflexive and is based on a really deep understanding of international legal doctrine. Her work has paid great attention to ambiguity and contribution. So while her critique of international and national legal systems is unflinching, her writing, I was really struck, is essentially optimistic. She's always searching for signs of advance, points of contradiction that leave some space for pushing for change within the law. In this sense, she departs from the more pessimistic urgings of legal academics such as Janet Halley, who's argued famously that we should simply just take a break from feminism. So Di sort of rejects that approach and is looking for transformation inside the law. A good example of Di's willingness to participate in reimaginings of international human rights law is her work on the sex-gender distinction. The idea that sex is biological and fixed and gender is a social construction has permeated much feminist literature and to a certain extent, in its own curious way, has been imbibed by the United Nations. Di suggests rather that we should understand this distinction as multiple and shifting rather than dualistic. Those are her words. She rejects the idea of the body as fixed biologically and sees it rather as culturally produced, thus undermining the standard international approaches that see women as in need of protection. For Di, gender is best understood as a technology of power that can disadvantage men and other gender identities as well as women. She highlights the often tentative advances by the UN human rights treaty bodies in this field, but retains faith, and this is a quote from her, that the discursive practices of international human rights law can reconceive sex-gender as a fluid conception that has multiple possible forms of expression and identification. So this hopeful approach to the emancipatory potential of the law distinguishes Di, I think, from many other critical theorists in international law. So Di's appointment to the Francine McNiff Chair is a recognition, I think, of her tremendous international scholarly reputation, but it also is a recognition of her great generosity as a teacher and as a colleague, and her distinctive style of academic leadership. But I think also, and this is a cause for more general celebration, it marks the significance of human rights as part of Australian legal education. And all these reasons give us a great cause for celebration. So many thanks, Di.
Well, it's very difficult to follow such a generous and glowing introduction, Hilary. I can't thank you enough, and I certainly am so pleased to be the recipient of one of the very few moments that we have set aside to reflect on someone's work. I plan to extend this much further and cover a lot of other people before I finish up here in the law school. But thank you, Hilary. Hilary, as she said, and gave me my first encounter with international human rights law in 1991 as a student in her class. And I suspect there are a couple of other people in this room who are also students in that class. And it's lovely to see everyone here, so many familiar faces from different parts of my life. It's really, it makes me feel very emotional. Thanks, Anne, too, for those introductory remarks, and for Vesna. I know we thank Vesna at the end, but I'd like to thank you up front for doing such a fantastic job of organising this today. In addition to embarking together on a journey through some feminist encounters with international human rights law, as you know, we're here to also recognise and celebrate Francine V, and I don't know why the V is always there. It almost looks like a case, Francine versus McNiff. Francine's generous gift to the Melbourne Law School, which enabled the establishment of the chair in human rights law in her name, and as Hilary said, it's a chair that I now have the honour and pleasure of occupying. Francine's encounters with the law here in Victoria, as I think they've all been mentioned, but let me just go through them again. As a law lecturer at Monash during the 70s, as a criminal law barrister who specialised in computer crime, and as an authority on the Children's Court, led to her being the first woman to be appointed to judicial office in Victoria when she was appointed to the Children's Court in 1983. And actually at that time I was an outreach youth worker in Victoria, so it's quite possible that our paths crossed then. But they've crossed again now, and that gives me a great deal of pleasure. Her achievement of being the first woman appointed to judicial office in Victoria takes on an even more important dimension when it's recognised that it took another 13 years before a woman was appointed to the Supreme Court in Victoria. So this was a great achievement both for Francine herself and more generally for women in the law in Victoria. In the preface to her Guide to Children's Courts Practice in Victoria, published in 1979, she observes that almost nothing had been written about the children's courts, despite them being in existence for over 70 years at that time. And then she goes on to say this: the text is designed to be descriptive rather than critical, due to the perceived need for information by those who are or wish to become involved with the courts. This decision should not be interpreted as an endorsement of the validity of the present system. However, wider understanding of the functioning of the courts may provide a starting point for more constructive analysis and criticism. I do not know whether Francine considered herself to be a feminist, but I recognise her desire to explain that her engagement with law shouldn't be misinterpreted as a sign of her endorsement of it. This dilemma of how to work critically from within the law confronts every feminist lawyer, including those of us who teach. So my starting point is to observe that feminist engagement with the law has always been complicated. And I think I am going to echo a lot of the observations that Hilary's made already. Indeed, there's a long history of antipathy between law and feminist aspirations. Early last century, suffragettes in the UK protesting women's exclusion from politics and their exploitation in sweatshops were jailed and force-fed when they went on hunger strike. And this wonderful image is actually from an old suffragette poster from that time. Colonial laws limited women's freedoms in the name of civilising them and criminalised attempts to resist, like the so-called runaway wives in Tanzania. The law has denied or limited women's sexual and reproductive freedoms everywhere, and abortion remains a criminal offence in the majority of countries and may even be recriminalised in Victoria if that balance of power MP Jeff Shaw gets his way at the moment. Recently, members of feminist punk band Pussy Riot were punished with long sentences in remote and brutal Siberian prisons. Their questioning of Russian democracy, homophobia and gender conformity was described in panicked terms by the judge at their trial as, I quote, shattering the constitutional foundations of the state. In other parts of the world, counter-terrorism laws have been used to stigmatise and imprison feminist and queer human rights defenders. As we speak, single mothers are being demonised again, this time in the rush to justify ferocious austerity measures. In these examples, and of course there are many more, the law provides a vehicle for denigrating and punishing feminist activism and for limiting women's autonomies and freedoms and necessitating our continuing economic dependence on men, all in the paternalistic guise of protecting us from our own irrational and hysterical impulses. We are burdened with a long heritage of women being conceived in law as the property, extension or dependence of men, and as primarily wives and mothers who lack agency or can't be trusted with it. Many parallels can be drawn here with colonial laws and their justifications, which means that women outside the West have been doubly restricted by law, a burden that has continued into the post-colonial era. The importance for feminists, then, of the emergence of a new body of law in the aftermath of World War II, international human rights law, cannot therefore be underestimated. It presented law in a different frame, as an emancipatory tool that promised equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms for everyone, including women. International human rights law made it possible to imagine different kinds of feminist encounters with law, not just as a repressive and negative force to be resisted, but as a potential vehicle for women's liberation, as we described our project in the 1970s, or, when I go back to Pussy Riot here, one of their members put it recently, as a means to foster a radical rebellion of vulvas against the cultural order. Oh dear. Not a rebellion directed at children, which tries to constantly redefine them and show them their appropriate place. A promise, especially by law, is powerful because it offers hope that a different world is possible. It creates an imaginative space, something that is critical to feminist struggles, that encourages thinking about the present critically rather than as inevitability. I have an old International Women's Day poster from 20 years ago blue-tacked onto the wall outside my office to remind me of what a feminist imaginary might look like. It demands a stop to cuts in the public sector, free accessible education for all, free childcare, bringing the unions back to the people, freedom of sexuality, women's economic independence, women's right to work, quality healthcare and justice for all women. How does our shared feminist vision look like today, 20 years later? Do we have one? Have we given up on free childcare and free education? Without alternative visions, feminists are rudderless in the treacherous currents of masculinist and imperial power and the fanatic inevitabilities of the free market. Just as without knowledge of the histories of feminist struggles in law, we are destined to think we are only at the start of a struggle rather than in a position to learn from our past. So by sharing with you today 4 stories of feminist encounters with this hopeful new body of law, I want to convey some of this history before turning to the question of how we can help to keep alive feminist visions of a future in which the politics of inevitability, which treats gender as intractably dualistic and hierarchical, has no place, and gender is instead valued as a marker of human desire, creativity, and diversity. Encounter 1, then. It was in the spirit of embracing international human rights law as a potential ally in the struggle for women's emancipation that in 1945, feminists lobbied the UN to establish the Commission on the Status of Women, which I will refer to a number of times, so I'm going to shorten it to the CSW. As a parallel body to the UN Commission on Human Rights. The success of this campaign meant that a new means of encounter had opened up, giving feminists a formal position inside an international institution for the first time. Indeed, in a promising move, many states appointed feminists, rather than diplomats, to be their representatives to the CSW, which was described at the time by one UN official as comprised by women who were all militants in their own countries and acted as a kind of lobby for the women of the world. I can only imagine that states thought, now that this new body would be turned inwards and would not have an impact on the rest of the organisation. Anyway, members of the CSW had their first encounter with human rights law through their participation in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1947 and 48. At the helm was Danish feminist Bodil Begtrup, the chair of the CSW, who was in constant communication with the vice chair, Australian Jessie Street, who was unable to be present. Their goal was to ensure that explicit reference was made to rights that were specific to women's experience within the new framework of equality, hoping that protective approaches to women would be relegated to the past. As it emerged, this strategy of being explicit about women's rights clashed with the view of the majority of the Commission on Human Rights, including its chair, Eleanor Roosevelt. The majority felt that a general prohibition of sex discrimination was the strongest way forward, and that making specific reference to women's rights would weaken the position of women by undercutting the meaning of everyone and introducing rights that were not universal in nature. This meant, however, that the universal would be measured against men's experience. This dilemma about how best to include women in the universal, or whether it's possible to feminise the universal, to put it another way, was left unresolved then and continues to present a conundrum for feminist human rights advocates today. In the end, there were two specific references to women made in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the context of the family and in relation to motherhood. Hardly a feminist victory. Despite the new commitments to equality, women were still only visible in their domestic and reproductive roles. Another part of the story of this encounter was the CSW's concern with the use of masculine pronouns and nouns to refer to the generic universal subject. The opening words of Article 1, for example, initially referred to all men being born equal in dignity and rights, and went on to say that people should treat each other as brothers. As the CSW representative said at the time, if we say all men, when we get home, it will be all men. Their concerns were again dismissed by the majority of the drafters, who argued that terms like man and mankind were understood as generic and therefore inclusive of women. Having met a brick wall, the CSW representatives decided to take their case to the UN Secretary-General, and he was persuaded to intervene on their behalf, and thus we have all human beings in the opening words of the Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and liberal use of the language of everyone in many other articles, although the pronoun he is still used. Today, this early encounter feels uncanny in its reflection of what was to come. Feminists continue to grapple with the same questions. How can we work for emancipatory goals from inside international legal and political institutions without co-option? Is it possible to reimagine universal standards so that they are inclusive of women? What does it mean for the feminist project to appeal to top-down forms of masculinist power in order to succeed? Encounter 2. Despite the early efforts of the CSW, for more than 30 years, women's concerns did largely disappear in the universal language and mindsets of those involved with developing and applying universal human rights law. Even human rights NGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch were concerned primarily, if not exclusively, with addressing human rights violations experienced by men. In frustration, in the mid-1970s, the CSW started to work towards a separate treaty that would deal with women's rights and establish a separate treaty body to monitor its implementation. This project received a great deal of support from grassroots women's movements who mobilised to celebrate International Women's Year in 1975 and continued to network internationally over the following UN Decade for Women. Thus, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, better known as CEDAW, was adopted by the General Assembly in 1979. Many states rushed to ratify this new convention, and it rapidly entered into force in 1981. And today it's almost universally ratified with 188 states parties. Among those few who have failed to ratify is, of course, the US, but that's another story. Yet, as so often happens in the field of law, appearances are deceiving. CEDAW has the highest number of reservations of any human rights treaty, which means that many states' parties have said they will not comply with certain provisions in the Convention. Frequently, these reservations reject women's equality in the family and their equality before the law in the name of religion or culture. Some of them are so far-reaching that they undermine CEDAW's whole raison d'etre. This sheds a different light on CEDAW's almost universal ratification. Behind the appearance of widespread support for women's equal rights, the legal device of the reservation enables states to do the opposite. Making matters worse, the CEDAW Committee has until quite recently been geographically and administratively separated from the other treaty bodies and provided an excuse for them to continue to neglect women's human rights violations because they were now the business of the CEDAW Committee. One way to read this saga is that the fear of Eleanor Roosevelt and others in 1948 has been borne out, that paying specific attention to women's human rights would weaken the position of women and detract from the power of universality. Yet what was the alternative? With women disappeared in the universal. And how is it that protective and demeaning ideas about women still find room to legally flourish in the new era of human rights for everybody? Encounter 3. In the late 1980s, feminists launched another concerted effort to put women's human rights abuses on the mainstream agenda of international legal and political institutions. This effort was organised from largely outside the UN in the form of a global campaign to end violence against women. The hope was that violations of women's physical integrity could not be ignored by human rights advocates, because this went to the very heart of the Human Rights Project, which recognises the right to life and the right to be free from torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment as fundamental. This campaign was successful in many respects. New international instruments condemning violence against women have been adopted. All the human rights treaty bodies have acknowledged that violence against women falls within their remit, and efforts have spilled over and brought about reforms in other areas of law, including international humanitarian and criminal law. I think it's true to say that the silence about violence against women has, in many parts of the world, been well and truly broken. Yet, much of this has been achieved by relying on very traditional ideas about women, which reduces them, us again, to vulnerable victims with limited capacity for agency who need paternalistic protection and rescue rather than full enjoyment of our human rights. These victimised tropes rely heavily on images of violence against women outside the West, who are portrayed as perpetually marginalised and mistreated and regularly presented as more victimised than their Western counterparts. This has breathed new life into an old pretext for imperial intrusions, claiming legitimacy for military and market interventions in the name of rescuing women from their own uncivilised, though we use the word undeveloped today, men and cultures. The focus on violence against women has also had other unintended consequences. It has lent support to harsher security regimes and to law and order responses to poverty and disadvantage. It has supported a proliferation of criminal laws internationally and domestically, imposing harsher border controls in the name of rescuing women from traffickers, punishing anti-prostitution laws in the name of protecting women from exploitation, and increasing police search and entry powers in the name of addressing domestic violence. It has to be asked how the carceral state came to be included in feminist imaginaries. In making this critique, I don't want to deny the urgent need to address the pandemic of violence against women. Right now, nearly 300 schoolgirls in Nigeria are held captive by Islamic fundamentalists who oppose girls being educated and plan to sell them as child brides. There is an obvious role for the criminal law to play, but the inordinate focus on criminal sanctions has not only revived protective ideas about women, but diverted attention away from the need to address causal factors, such as women's lack of economic and social autonomy, their limited and unsafe access to education, their denial of reproductive health services and choices, and their exclusion from politics. This encounter, through the campaign against violence against women, highlights the dangers that can arise when legal and political institutions actually embrace feminist ideas, which then makes those ideas selectively available to serve the ends of the institution, which may well undermine the goals of feminism. It apprises us of the propensity of at least some feminist ideas to serve military and imperial agendas, reminding us not to be seduced away from maintaining our wariness of these same institutions that we look to support feminist goals. This encounter also provides a cautionary tale about the perils of focusing on a single issue. Encounter 4. At about the same time as the global campaign to end violence against women was gathering pace, another feminist strategy emerged which refocused attention on the coverage of the universal. This strategy sought to mainstream gender in all the work of the UN human rights treaty bodies. The idea was to promote gender-inclusive interpretations of all human rights, which it was hoped would obviate the need to recognise separate or specific women's rights, and thereby avoid the marginalisation of women's issues in separate treaties and bodies, prevent protective and paternalistic responses to women from re-emerging, and bring men's experience of gender discrimination into consideration as well. Despite early resistance, this plan has also met with considerable success, at least on paper. The main human rights treaty bodies have taken some thoughtful steps towards feminising the universal subject. For example, the right to life has been interpreted to include obligations to help women prevent unwanted pregnancies and ensure they do not have to undergo life-threatening clandestine abortions. And the right to life has also been interpreted as including obligations to prevent poverty and deprivation that may pose a threat to women's lives. The right to social security has been interpreted expansively to require not only adequate maternity leave for women, but paternity leave for men and parental leave for both women and men. The right to be free from torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment has been interpreted to include domestic and other forms of violence against women, including rape. This week, the UN Committee Against Torture grilled the Holy See, and the Holy See is a fantastic trope to have in international law because they fall outside of so many of the categories or challenge what you think's going on. So the Vatican can ratify international human rights treaties because it's a non-state member of the UN. So the UN Committee Against Torture grilled them this week on their record related to torture, including clerical sexual abuse and violations of women's reproductive rights. These are hopeful developments, a very long way from the 30 years of women's invisibility that followed the adoption of the Universal Declaration in 1948, and a further 20 years of their marginalisation following the adoption of CEDAW in 1979. But these developments remain largely in the realm of the conceptual, and there are many hurdles to overcome before they will be realised in practice. In fact, a great deal of gender mainstreaming practice has had the effect of turning feminist political goals into a top-down technocratic exercise of ticking off checklists and satisfying performance indicators. This is a very long way from the grassroots women's movements that can breathe life into gender mainstreaming initiatives. So, a few thoughts in conclusion. I've chosen the language of encounter deliberately because it conveys something of the riskiness of feminist attempts to explore the emancipatory possibilities in law. There is a certain incommensurability between feminist aspirations and the disciplinary languages and practices of law, even international human rights law, which, despite appearances to the contrary, continues to foster protective and dehumanising stereotypes of women. Too often, feminist efforts to achieve women's full inclusion in the universal have simply reproduced unequal relations of gender power and proved disturbingly amenable to neoliberal imperial co-option. Yet much has always been gained, and this is the hopeful side of me, which I hope you'll go away with. Footholds have been created in legal instruments and institutions from which further feminist strategies can be launched. Importantly, international networks of women's rights movements have grown around and in response to these footholds, cooperating in their search for more effective ways to hold governments and international institutions accountable. Sex, or gender, has to some extent been released from its conservative moorings in nature and biology and is increasingly understood as a contested social category that can have multiple and fluid forms of expression. From my vantage point, the feminist project of denaturalising sex needs to be taken to its logical conclusion in its encounters with human rights law. The idea that we all have a gender identity rather than a biologically determined sex seems to me to provide the framework for another strategy. We need to abandon the idea of gender as male-female duality, just as the High Court did recently in a case brought by Sydney identity Norrie, who identifies as gender non-specific. In an exercise of statutory interpretation, the court recognised that a person may be other than male or female, and therefore that the New South Wales Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages should permit Norrie's gender registration as non-specific. Taking this further, if gender identity is understood as a form of social expression that may be reflected in body types but not determined by them, a multiplicity of gender possibilities come into view, including transgender, femme, butch, queer, intersex, as well as sex non-specific and male and female. If international human rights law was to acknowledge the diversity of gendered subject positions, the dualistic hierarchies of gender that we have found so difficult to shift would be seriously destabilised, and a full range of sex gender possibilities would be opened as never before, or that's the hope. Now, I know this sounds very remote from the realities of the everyday violence and marginalisation endured by the majority of women and girls in the here and now. We must continue to struggle to extract the maximum justice for women and others who are mistreated because of their gender that is possible in the present systems of law and politics. This necessitates devoting at least as much energy to supporting the activism of women outside the mainstream institutions of law and politics as to carving out spaces on the inside, which will always extract the price of compromise and dilution, unless there are movements of women in coalition with others demanding otherwise. But we must also keep our feminist imaginations in energetic motion, ensuring that we are always open to exploring new possibilities for justice beyond the limits of the law as we know it. As Francine V McNiff sought to explain in 1979, and as I hope to reflect during my time in her chair, feminist engagement with law must always be rich with questions and cautions, while never letting go of our yearnings for emancipatory inclusion. Thanks.
Fantastic, and thanks to everyone who's come today for such great questions, which I think have drawn out, as Hilary pointed out, the incredibly very deep contextual nuance of your work over a very long time, so thank you. And I think using the examination of the device and the trope and the activity of encounter reminds us all, and I think this is really the important point of today's lecture and of Di's contributions over her career, of what it is to be a feminist and a lawyer. And this requires, as we've just been talking about in that fantastic last question, imagination, but also, as Hilary's pointed out, as well, collaboration, perseverance and leadership. And so the encounters of feminists with and at international law, and I must point out with domestic law also, I think we've also been reminded today, has been for such a long time, an integral part of the critical project of law. And I think it's so important to remind us to remember that and address that and celebrate that in those terms. So I'd like to thank you all very much for coming, to thank Di for the honour of participating in this event, and once again to thank, on behalf of everyone, to thank the amazing Vesna Stefanovsky for her professional and personal skill that enables events like these where we can gather together as an intellectual community and an institutional community also to happen so successfully. So thank you all.